Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into a question that feels simple at first, and then slowly unfolds into something far more curious, far more elusive, the question of how you might prove that you are a traveller in time. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into time travel together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. Tonight, we won't be building a time machine or racing through glowing tunnels of light. Instead, we'll explore something much quieter and in some ways, much stranger. Imagine, just for a moment, that without warning, without preparation, you suddenly find yourself somewhere else in time. Not in a distant galaxy, not in a dream, but right here, in this same place, only years or even centuries earlier. The air feels familiar, but something is slightly off. The world is the same, but not quite the same, and you standing there, holding nothing but what you already have with you, are faced with a simple, almost innocent question. How do you prove that you don't belong here? It sounds like the kind of puzzle you might solve with a clever trick, a hidden piece of knowledge, a prediction, a demonstration of something no one else could know. But as we begin to explore it, gently and slowly, you may find that this question doesn't behave the way we expect. Because proving you are from the future is not just difficult. It may be something far deeper than that. It may be something that slips quietly beyond proof itself. So for now, just let the idea settle in your mind, like a small, curious ripple across still water, and when you're ready, we'll take the first step together. Now imagine this a little more clearly. You're exactly where you are right now. Maybe you're lying in bed, listening softly, or sitting somewhere quiet with a faint hum of the world around you. Nothing feels unusual, nothing feels out of place. And then, without warning, without any dramatic flash or sound, everything shifts, not violently, not loudly, just quietly. The room is still there. The walls, the objects, the shape of the space, it all looks the same, but something has changed. The year is different. You've been moved, not through space, but through time. Perhaps it's 20 years earlier. Perhaps it's a century, or perhaps even further, to a place where the familiar details of modern life begin to fade into something older, simpler, and slightly harder to recognize. But you are still you. You still carry your memories, your knowledge, your sense of what the world is supposed to be, and standing there in that slightly unfamiliar version of the present, you realize something important. No one knows what just happened to you. To everyone else, you're simply a person, a stranger perhaps, or someone slightly out of place, but nothing more. And that is when the question begins to form, not urgently, not loudly, but quietly, almost like a whisper in your mind. How would you prove that you came from the future? At first it feels like there must be an easy answer. You might think, well, I know things. I know what will happen. I can tell them. You imagine yourself calmly explaining events that have not yet occurred. Maybe something large and undeniable, a major discovery, a global event, something so certain that once it happens, everyone will have to believe you. And yet, There is a small problem hidden inside that idea. Time. If you predict something that will happen years from now, then people would have to wait years to verify it. And in the meantime, what are you? A person making bold claims. A person with confidence. A person who might simply be guessing, or imagining, or trying to convince others of something that sounds extraordinary. Even if you are right, the proof arrives too late, and something about that feels unsatisfying. So you might try a different approach, something faster, something immediate. Perhaps you could predict something small, something that will happen tomorrow or next week, something that can be checked quickly. But here, another quiet complication begins to appear. Because even if you are correct, even if you predict something with perfect accuracy, there are always simpler explanations. People might think you're lucky, or clever, or connected in some hidden way to the outcome. They might suspect coincidence, or trickery, or knowledge gained through ordinary means. And slowly, gently, a realization begins to settle in. It is not enough to be right. You must be undeniably right. So right that no other explanation feels possible. And that is a much higher bar than it first appears. You might pause here just for a moment and let that thought drift, because it reveals something subtle about how we understand truth. We don't just believe things because they are true. We believe them because they are the best explanation available to us. And time travel is almost never the simplest explanation. Not when compared to luck. Not when compared to intelligence. Not when compared to deception. And so, even before we begin to explore tools, strategies, or clever demonstrations, we find ourselves facing something deeper, a quiet kind of resistance. Not from physics, not from technology, but from the way human minds work. And perhaps, as you lie there, letting your thoughts move slowly from one idea to the next, you can feel the shape of the problem forming. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it's just persistent. Like trying to convince someone of something that sounds too strange to be real, even when it is. And so the question remains, still gently unfolding. If knowing the future is not enough, then what could ever be? And that is where our journey truly begins. If you let that question linger for a little while, something interesting begins to happen. At first, it feels like a problem of evidence. You imagine that if you could just gather the right facts, present the right proof, say the right things in the right order, then eventually someone would understand. But as you sit with it a little longer, more quietly, it begins to shift. It stops feeling like a problem of what you know, and starts to feel like a problem of what others are willing to believe. And that difference, though subtle, changes everything. Because imagine yourself again in that earlier time. You speak to someone, calmly, clearly, explaining that you have come from the future. You might even offer details, specific, precise, carefully chosen details meant to show that your knowledge is not ordinary. Perhaps you describe an invention that doesn't exist yet, or an event that has not yet happened, or a pattern that no one has noticed. You expect curiosity, maybe even wonder. But what you often receive instead is hesitation, a quiet pause, a searching look, because the person listening to you is doing something very natural, something all of us do, often without realizing it. They are looking for the simplest explanation, not the most exciting one, not the most extraordinary one, the simplest one. And in that quiet process, your claim that you've travelled through time faces a difficult challenge, because there are always easier explanations. Perhaps you're simply very knowledgeable, someone who has studied deeply, read widely, connected ideas in ways others have not. Or perhaps you are lucky, someone who has made a guess and happened to be right. Or, in less generous interpretations. Perhaps you're mistaken, or exaggerating, or even deliberately misleading. None of these explanations require bending the laws of the universe. None of them require time to flow in unusual ways. They are familiar, comfortable, and because they are familiar, they're easier to accept. This quiet preference has been observed in many areas of thinking, from everyday reasoning to scientific investigation. When faced with multiple explanations, people tend to favor the one that introduces the fewest new assumptions, the one that fits most neatly into what they already understand. You don't need to remember a formal name for this idea, but you might recognize the feeling of it. It's the reason why, if you hear a noise in the night, you assume it's the wind or a shifting piece of furniture before you consider something stranger. It's the reason why, if someone predicts something correctly, you think of coincidence before you think of something extraordinary. And in the case of time travel, this tendency becomes especially powerful, because time travel is not just unusual, it is deeply unfamiliar. It asks the listener to accept that the past and the future are not as fixed as they seem, that movement through time is possible, that cause and effect may not always flow in a straight line. That is a very large step to take. So even if your explanation is true, it has to compete with explanations that feel much smaller, much simpler, much easier to hold. And slowly, gently, this leads to a realization that feels almost paradoxical. Being correct is not enough. You must be correct in a way that leaves no room for any simpler explanation, and that is an incredibly high bar. Imagine, for example, that you correctly predict the outcome of a random event, something like a lottery draw where numbers are selected seemingly without pattern. You describe the numbers in advance, they appear exactly as you said. It feels convincing. But then, the mind begins its quiet work again. Maybe it was luck. Unlikely. Yes, but not impossible. So you try again, another correct prediction, and again, and again. At some point the pattern becomes difficult to ignore, but even then, people may search for alternative explanations. Perhaps you have access to hidden information. Perhaps the system itself is flawed. Perhaps there is something about the situation that they do not yet understand. Notice how, even as the evidence grows stronger, the mind continues to look for ways to keep the explanation grounded in what is already known. Time travel remains a last resort, a conclusion reached only when every other possibility has been exhausted. And exhausting every other possibility is remarkably difficult, because there are so many of them. Luck can explain more than we expect. Skill can appear almost magical when it is unfamiliar. Deception, though uncomfortable to consider, is always a possibility in human interaction. And so, your task becomes something much more subtle than simply showing that you are right. You must show that every other explanation is less plausible, that there is no hidden trick, no fortunate coincidence, no clever guess, no ordinary pathway that could lead to the same result. Only then does the idea of time travel begin to feel not just possible, but necessary. And even then, there may still be doubt, because doubt in many ways is the mind's way of protecting itself from ideas that feel too large, too disruptive, too far outside its current map of the world. You might find it helpful to imagine belief not as a switch that turns on or off, but as something softer, more like a landscape. Ideas settle into that landscape based on how well they fit with what is already there. And time travel is like placing a mountain in a place where only gentle hills have ever existed. It can be done. But it requires more than a single piece of evidence. It requires a reshaping of the entire landscape. So as you continue to rest with this idea, you may begin to feel the quiet weight of the challenge. not dramatic, not overwhelming, just persistent. A kind of gentle resistance that comes not from the world itself, but from the way we interpret it. And this leads us, almost naturally, to the next question. If simple predictions are not enough, and if being right is not enough, then what kind of evidence could ever rise above all simpler explanations? What could feel so immediate, so undeniable, that it leaves no room for doubt? And somewhere in that question, a different kind of strategy begins to take shape, not about predicting the future, but about revealing something that is already hidden, waiting quietly to be found. If you follow that thought a little further, you begin to notice something almost poetic about it. The future, which feels so full of answers, turns out to be a very quiet kind of evidence, because at first, prediction seems like the perfect solution. You know what will happen, you've seen it before, you carry with you memories of events that to everyone else have not yet unfolded. So naturally it feels like you could simply describe those events and let reality confirm your story. A kind of slow, unfolding proof. But there is something about time that complicates this idea in a very gentle, almost invisible way. Because time does not hurry, and proof that depends on time must wait. Imagine telling someone with complete confidence that something significant will happen many years from now. Perhaps a global event, something unmistakable. You describe it clearly, you explain it carefully, and then nothing happens. Not immediately, not soon. Days pass, then weeks, then years. And during that long, quiet stretch of waiting, your certainty begins to feel less like evidence and more like a story. Because to the person listening, nothing has changed yet. The world continues as it always has, and without confirmation, your prediction becomes something soft, something uncertain, something easy to set aside, even if one day it turns out to be true. By then, the connection has faded. The memory of your claim has softened at the edges, and the moment of proof, when it finally arrives, no longer carries the same weight. It feels distant, almost accidental. So you might think instead of shortening the distance. Predict something closer, something that will happen tomorrow or next week, something that can be verified quickly, and this feels like progress. Because now, when the prediction comes true, it happens while your words are still fresh in the listener's mind. There is a moment of recognition, a brief pause where the coincidence feels noticeable. But then, very quietly, something familiar begins to happen again. The mind searches for alternatives. Perhaps it was a good guess. Perhaps you noticed patterns others missed. Perhaps the event was not as unpredictable as it seemed. And once again, the explanation settles into something that feels ordinary, even when the outcome was exact. You might try to refine it further. Make your predictions more precise, more detailed, more unlikely. And for a while, this begins to create a kind of tension. Each correct prediction adds a small weight to your claim. Each one makes the simple explanations feel slightly less comfortable. But even then, the process remains slow, and time, once again, becomes the quiet obstacle. Because you are still waiting. Waiting for events to unfold. Waiting for the world to catch up to your knowledge. And while you wait, the moment of proof continues to drift just out of reach. There is also another, more subtle complication. One that is easy to miss at first. It has to do with the way events depend on the world around them. Nothing happens in isolation. Every outcome is shaped by countless small influences, movements, decisions, conditions, all interacting in ways that are difficult to fully trace. And when you introduce yourself into the past, even in the smallest way. You become part of that system. You change it, perhaps only slightly, perhaps in ways that seem insignificant, but even small changes can ripple outward. A conversation that wouldn't have happened, a decision that is delayed by a moment, a tiny shift in attention, like a breeze that alters the path of something delicate. And slowly, gently, this introduces a quiet uncertainty, because the future you remember is not guaranteed to unfold in exactly the same way, not when the conditions have changed, not when you are now part of the story. You might think of it like remembering the path of a leaf floating on water. You saw where it went. You remember the turns, the pauses, the final resting place. But if you step into the stream, even lightly, the currents shift, and the leaf may follow a slightly different path. Not wildly different, but different enough, and that difference is enough to soften your predictions, to make them less certain, less exact, less convincing. So now, prediction faces two quiet challenges. It takes time to verify, and it depends on a future that may no longer be perfectly stable. And together, these challenges begin to reshape the problem once again. Because what you need is not just correctness. You need immediacy. You need something that can be checked right away, without waiting, without delay, without uncertainty. Something that does not depend on what will happen, but on what already exists, hidden, unknown, waiting quietly in the present. And as that idea begins to form, it brings with it a different kind of possibility, a way of thinking that does not look forward, but instead looks sideways into the unnoticed corners of the world, places where knowledge exists but has not yet been discovered, where something lost is still waiting to be found. And if you could reveal those things, not in the future, but now, then perhaps, just for a moment, the distance between knowing and proving might begin to shrink. If you stay with that thought, just for a moment longer, something begins to shift. Until now, every attempt to prove you are from the future has been pointed forward, toward events that have not yet happened, toward things that must unfold before they can be confirmed. But what if, instead of looking ahead, you turned your attention slightly to the side, not to the future, but to the present, or more precisely, to the parts of the present that remain hidden? Because all around us, even in the most familiar world, there are things that exist, but are not yet known, objects that have been lost, places that have not yet been discovered, details that are real, but quietly waiting, beyond the reach of current knowledge. And this is where a different kind of idea begins to take shape. Instead of predicting what will happen, you reveal what already exists. Imagine, for example, that you're standing in a time when a great ship has been lost. People know the story. They know it sank. They know the general region. But the exact resting place remains a mystery. Searches have been made, theories proposed, but the ocean is vast, and the answer lies somewhere deep beneath its surface, unseen. And then you speak. Not about something that will happen, but about something that is already there. You describe a location, not vaguely, but precisely. You might say something like, a point in the open sea, measured not in equations or symbols, but in directions and distance, a place that lies, perhaps, a little north of a certain line, and a little west of another, described in a way that anyone with a map and a compass could follow. You're not asking them to wait, you're inviting them to look, and this changes something, because now the proof does not depend on time, it depends on discovery. A ship is sent, a search is made, and if the object is found exactly where you said it would be, then something very quiet and very powerful begins to happen. The explanation of luck starts to feel less comfortable, because luck tends to be broad, general, but this is specific, measured, exact. And yet, even here, something interesting remains, because a single correct discovery is still not enough. It is impressive, certainly, remarkable even. But the mind, as it always does, continues its gentle search for alternatives. Perhaps you are an expert, someone who studied the patterns of currents, debris, history, and arrived at the conclusion through careful reasoning. Perhaps you had access to hidden information, something not widely known, but not impossible. So once again, the explanation settles into something familiar, not fully satisfying, but still possible. And so the idea evolves, not just one discovery, but several, different kinds, different places, different stories. You might reveal the location of another lost vessel, one that sank under entirely different circumstances, then perhaps something else, not in the ocean this time, but beneath the earth, an object buried long ago, forgotten by time, rediscovered only much later. Each revelation adds a layer, and what matters is not just that they are correct, but that they are independent, unrelated, spanning different fields of knowledge, different parts of the world, different moments in history. Because now, the explanation of expertise begins to stretch, to cover one discovery perhaps, to cover two with some effort, but to explain many across entirely different domains, that becomes harder, and slowly, gently, the balance begins to shift. The simple explanations, the ones that once felt comfortable, begin to feel strained, not impossible, but less natural. And in that quiet tension, your claim starts to take on a different shape. Not as a bold statement, not as a demand to be believed, but as a pattern that no single ordinary explanation can fully contain. There is also something else that makes this approach feel different. Something subtle, but important. It offers immediacy. The person listening to you does not have to wait years. They do not have to trust your memory, or your intentions, or your interpretation of events. They only have to look, to go to a place, to uncover something that was already there, hidden, silent, waiting. And in doing so, they become part of the proof. They do not just hear your claim, they verify it. And that changes the experience entirely, because belief, when it comes from direct observation, feels very different from belief that depends on trust. It feels grounded, personal, real. But even as this idea settles, gently and convincingly, there is a quiet question that lingers beneath it, a question that does not rush to the surface, but waits. Because while this method feels stronger, more immediate, more difficult to dismiss, it is still not perfect. There are still possibilities, however unlikely, that could explain what has happened, possibilities that the mind may reach for, especially when faced with something extraordinary. And so, even here, even in this promising approach, the problem is not entirely solved. It has only become more refined, more subtle, like moving closer to the centre of a puzzle, only to find that the pieces themselves are more delicate than they first appeared. And as we continue, slowly, quietly, we may begin to see that proving you are a time traveller is not about finding a single answer, but about navigating a landscape of doubt where every step forward reveals another layer, another question, another gentle resistance waiting just beneath the surface. As that idea settles, revealing what is already hidden, something else begins to come into focus. At first, it feels like you've found the answer. Not predictions that must wait. Not stories about the future, but something immediate. Something real. You show them where to look, and they find it. A ship beneath the ocean. A relic beneath the earth. A detail that no one else seemed to know until you spoke. And for a moment, there is silence. A quiet pause where the world seems to tilt ever so slightly, because something has happened that cannot be easily ignored, and yet, even in that moment, belief does not arrive all at once. It doesn't rush in like a wave. It moves slowly, carefully, almost cautiously. Because even a correct answer, even a discovery made exactly where you said it would be, still leaves space for doubt. Not loud doubt, not rejection, just a gentle question that lingers in the background. How? And more importantly, could there be another explanation? You might imagine someone standing there, looking at the evidence, and then quietly turning it over in their mind. Perhaps you studied this. Perhaps you noticed something others missed. Perhaps you were very, very lucky. And while these explanations begin to feel less satisfying, they are not impossible, and as long as they are not impossible, they remain available, like doors that haven't quite closed. So something interesting begins to happen. The standard of proof rises, without anyone saying it out loud, without any formal rule, just naturally, quietly, inevitably. One discovery is not enough. 2 might begin to raise eyebrows. 3, now that becomes harder to ignore, but it is not just the number that matters, it is the difference between them. Imagine this. You reveal the location of a ship lost at sea. Then, somewhere else, you describe the resting place of an entirely different object. Not another ship. Something unrelated, perhaps something ancient, buried, forgotten, recovered only much later in history. And again, you're correct. Then a third, different again. Another place, another story, another kind of knowledge. Now the pattern begins to take shape, and what makes it powerful is not just repetition, but variety. Because explaining one correct answer is easy. Explaining many, across different domains, becomes something else entirely. Each new piece stretches the alternative explanations a little further. Luck becomes less convincing. Expertise becomes harder to define. Coincidence begins to feel fragile. And slowly, gently, the balance begins to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but like a scale that tips almost imperceptibly as more weight is added. You might think of it like hearing a single note. On its own, it could belong to anything, a random sound, a passing noise. But when a second note appears, and then a third, and then a fourth, and they begin to form a pattern, a melody, something changes. The mind recognizes structure, intent, meaning, and it becomes harder to explain it away as chance. In the same way, your knowledge begins to sound less like isolated guesses and more like a connected understanding, a thread that runs through different parts of the world, tying them together. And this introduces a quiet but powerful principle. It is not enough to be right once. You must be right, repeatedly, and in ways that cannot be explained by a single skill or perspective. Because the moment your knowledge can be contained within a familiar category, it loses its mystery. If all your discoveries are about the ocean, you become an ocean expert. If they are about ancient history, you become a historian. If they are about technology, you become an inventor. And in each case, the explanation remains comfortably grounded. So your proof must resist that. It must cross boundaries, move between different kinds of knowledge, different places, different times, until no single identity can hold it. until the explanation of expert begins to feel incomplete. And this is where something quite delicate begins to emerge, because now belief is no longer based on a single moment. It is built slowly, over time, each piece of evidence adding a small weight, each discovery narrowing the space for doubt, until eventually the simpler explanations begin to feel less natural, less satisfying, less able to account for everything that has been observed, and in that quiet narrowing, something new becomes possible. Not certainty, not absolute proof, but a shift, a gentle movement in the way the idea is held, from unlikely to perhaps to something closer to. There may be no better explanation, and yet, even here, even at this point, the problem is not entirely resolved, because there is always one more layer, one more question that can be asked, one more possibility, however small, that can be imagined. And this is what makes the challenge so strangely beautiful and so persistently difficult. Proof in this sense is not a single moment. It is a process, a gradual reshaping of belief through accumulation, through pattern, through quiet persistence. And even then, it may never feel complete, only sufficient, enough to tip the balance, enough to quiet the simpler explanations, if only for a while. And as you let that idea settle, softly, like a pattern forming in the background, you may begin to notice something else, a subtle shift in the nature of the challenge. Because now, it is no longer just about what you know. It is about how your knowledge is interpreted, how it is framed, how it is understood by others through the lens of what they already believe. And that introduces a new kind of question, a quieter one. If knowledge alone can be explained away, then what happens when knowledge begins to look like something else entirely? Something more familiar, something more human, something that can be mistaken for brilliance rather than something beyond it. As that pattern grows, quietly, steadily, something unexpected begins to happen. Your knowledge, which once felt mysterious, begins to take on a different shape in the minds of others. Not something impossible, not something outside the world they understand, but something human, remarkable, yes, unusual certainly, but still explainable. Because there is a familiar category that can absorb almost anything that appears extraordinary. And that category is genius. Imagine again that you have revealed several hidden truths, different places, different discoveries, different kinds of knowledge, each one correct, each one verified. And now, instead of asking how could this be possible, people begin to ask a different question. Who are you? Not as a traveller in time, but as a thinker, a person with an unusual mind, someone who sees patterns others miss, someone who understands the world at a deeper level. And slowly, almost gently, your explanation shifts. You're no longer a mystery that challenges reality. You're a prodigy, an expert, a once-in-a-generation intellect. And while this might feel like recognition, even admiration, it quietly dissolves the very thing you were trying to prove. Because now, your knowledge has been brought back into the familiar, contained within the idea of human ability. No matter how impressive your claims are, they're still interpreted through what people already believe is possible. And human intelligence, even at its most extraordinary, is still something we accept. We have seen it before, in scientists who predict unseen particles, in explorers who find hidden paths, in historians who uncover lost truths. In each case, what once seemed impossible becomes understandable, once it is framed as insight rather than anomaly. And so your situation becomes strangely delicate. The more convincing your knowledge is, the more it risks being reinterpreted as brilliance, and the more it is seen as brilliance, the less it points to time travel. It is almost as if your success begins to work against you, like a signal that fades into noise, not because it weakens, but because it blends too well with what is already expected. You might think of it like this. If someone solves a difficult puzzle, we don't assume they came from the future. We assume they are clever. If someone builds a machine ahead of its time, we don't assume they travelled through time. We assume they are innovative. And if someone reveals knowledge that others do not yet have, we assume they have found a way to learn it, even if that way is unclear, even if it seems unlikely, because once again, the simplest explanation holds its quiet place. And genius, however rare, is still simpler than time travel. There is also something deeper happening here, something more subtle. It has to do with how we understand knowledge itself. We tend to think of knowledge as something that can be discovered, something that can be reasoned toward, even if the path is difficult. So when you present information, even information that feels out of reach, the assumption is that there must be a path that leads to it, a hidden process, a chain of reasoning, a method, however complex, that connects what is known to what you have revealed. And this assumption is powerful because it allows people to preserve their understanding of the world. They don't have to change their beliefs about time. They don't have to accept that the future can reach into the past. They only have to accept that you are exceptional. And in doing so, they keep the world intact, stable, predictable, coherent, which is in many ways what the mind quietly prefers. So now, your challenge has become even more refined. It is no longer enough to be correct. It is no longer enough to be repeatedly correct. You must be correct in a way that cannot be explained as intelligence. And that is extraordinarily difficult, because intelligence is a flexible explanation. It stretches, it adapts, it grows to fit whatever shape it needs to hold. You might reveal something in physics and be seen as a physicist, something in history and be seen as a historian, something in mathematics and be seen as someone who understands numbers deeply. And each time, the explanation shifts just enough to remain comfortable, like a blanket that adjusts to cover whatever is exposed. So you begin to see the deeper pattern. Every path toward proof is met by a path toward explanation. Every attempt to stand outside the ordinary is gently pulled back into it, not by force, but by interpretation. And this leads to a quiet, almost philosophical question. Is there any kind of knowledge that cannot be explained as something human, something that cannot be reduced to skill or insight or creativity, something that resists being absorbed into what we already understand? And if such knowledge exists, what would it look like? Would it feel different? Would it stand out in a way that cannot be softened? Or would it too eventually be folded into the familiar, given enough time? As you rest with that thought, letting it drift slowly through your mind, you may begin to sense that the problem is not just about evidence. It is about interpretation, about the quiet ways in which we make sense of the world, even when the world offers us something unexpected. And perhaps, somewhere within that realization, there is another shift waiting to happen. Because if knowledge can always be explained away, then maybe the answer lies not in knowledge alone, but in something else entirely, something more tangible, something closer to the body, something that cannot be easily reasoned into existence, but must be experienced directly. As that question lingers, about knowledge that cannot be explained away, your attention begins to drift somewhere closer, closer to the things you carry, not abstract ideas, not distant theories, but the small, ordinary objects that remain with you, no matter where you are. Because imagine, once again, that moment of arrival. No preparation, no warning. You haven't packed a device from the future. You haven't brought a library of information. You only have what happens to be with you. Perhaps something in your pocket. Perhaps something on your wrist. Perhaps nothing more than your own hands. And yet, within those quiet, ordinary details, there may be something unexpected. Something that doesn't rely on memory alone, but exists physically, tangibly, in the world. You might begin to think of tools, not large machines, not complex systems, but simple, wearable things. Objects designed not to impress, but to assist. Imagine, for example, a small band wrapped gently around your wrist, flexible, light, almost forgettable. At first glance, it looks like nothing special, perhaps even a bit playful, but along its surface, there are markings, not random ones, but carefully arranged, a sequence that traces through time, not as a strict timeline, but as a collection of moments, points where something was lost and later found. Each marking quietly holds a story, a place, a coordinate, a direction, not written in symbols that require decoding, but in soft, readable language. North, south, east, west, distances that can be followed, locations that can be reached. And if you were to place this band into the hands of someone in the past, they wouldn't need to understand advanced mathematics. They wouldn't need to interpret complex formulas. They would only need to follow, to travel to a place, to look beneath the surface, to uncover something that has been waiting there all along. And in that sense, the object becomes more than a tool. It becomes a bridge between knowing and showing. There is something quietly powerful about this idea, because it shifts the burden of proof away from you. You're no longer asking someone to trust your memory or your explanation. You are giving them a path, a way to verify things for themselves. And that changes the experience entirely, but as you sit with it, you may notice another layer beginning to emerge, because even tools are not beyond interpretation. Someone might look at that band and see not a message from the future, but a carefully constructed artifact, a device made by someone clever, someone who gathered information and organized it in a useful way. Once again, the explanation bends toward the familiar, toward human ingenuity. So perhaps the tool must go further, not just providing information, but offering something that feels less like knowledge and more like ability, something that can be demonstrated directly in the moment. You might think of measurement, simple, physical measurement, the kind that doesn't depend on belief, but on observation. Imagine wrapping a flexible strip around a circular object, a pipe perhaps, or the trunk of a small tree. Normally, to understand the size of that object, you would measure the distance around it and then perform a calculation. You would take that distance and gently divide it by a familiar number, a number that appears whenever circles are involved, a number often called pi. It is the quiet relationship between the edge of a circle and its width. But what if the tool you carried had already accounted for that? What if the markings along it were spaced in such a way that when you wrapped it around something, the number you read was not the distance around, but the width itself? No calculation required, no division, just a direct result. You place it, you read it, you know. And to someone watching, this might feel unusual, not impossible, but unexpected. A kind of knowledge embedded in the object itself, something that simplifies what would otherwise require a step of reasoning. And again, this creates a small shift, not a dramatic one, but enough to make the observer pause just for a moment longer. Because now, what you are showing is not just information, but a different way of interacting with the world, a way that feels slightly ahead of its time, and yet, even here, the same quiet pattern returns, because tools can be made, methods can be discovered, ideas can be learned, and no matter how elegant your demonstration is, it can still be understood as something human, something clever, something inventive. There is also a more practical concern, one that feels almost mundane, but carries a surprising weight. What if you don't have the tool? What if the moment arrives and you are unprepared? No bracelet, no markings, no physical proof, only your memory, only your words. And suddenly, everything returns to where it began. Because without something external, something that exists outside your mind, you're once again asking others to trust something they cannot see, something they cannot verify immediately. And that is where belief begins to soften again. So the idea of tools, while promising, reveals its own limitations. They must be present, they must be understood, and they must still overcome the quiet tendency of the mind to interpret everything through what it already knows. As you rest with this thought, letting it settle gently, you may begin to feel the shape of the challenge becoming clearer. It is not just about what you know, not just about what you carry, but about how everything you present is filtered through expectation, through familiarity, through the quiet need to keep the world understandable. And perhaps, somewhere within that realization, there is another shift waiting. Because if knowledge can be explained, and tools can be explained, then what remains? What kind of evidence could exist that resists explanation altogether? Something that cannot be reduced to skill or invention or preparation. Something that feels undeniably out of place. And yet, even as that question begins to form, there is another quieter realization waiting just beneath it. Because before you can prove anything at all, there is something much more immediate to consider. Something physical, something unavoidable. The simple, quiet question of whether you could survive long enough to try. If you imagine yourself standing there in that earlier time, having carefully revealed what was hidden, having shown patterns that feel difficult to ignore, there is still something quiet, almost invisible, moving beneath everything. It is not doubt in the usual sense, not skepticism, not disbelief, but something more subtle, a kind of instability. Because all of your knowledge, every detail you remember, every event you try to describe, comes from a future that has already happened. At least it has happened for you, but the moment you arrive in the past, that future begins to loosen, just slightly, like a thread that is no longer pulled tight. At first, this feels insignificant. After all, what difference could a single person make? You're only one individual standing in a vast world filled with billions of small interactions. Surely your presence changes nothing important, and yet, the world does not move in large, predictable steps. It moves through countless small ones. A conversation here, a decision there, a delay of a few seconds, a glance that leads someone to notice something, or miss it entirely. And each of these moments, however small, feeds into the next. You might think of it like a calm surface of water. When undisturbed, it reflects everything clearly. The sky, the clouds, the quiet horizon. But the moment you touch it, even lightly, a ripple begins. It spreads outward, slowly at first, then wider, overlapping with other ripples. interacting, merging, reshaping the surface, and very quickly, the reflection becomes something else, not entirely unrecognizable, but no longer precise. This is the quiet idea often described in science as the sensitivity of systems to their starting conditions. But you don't need to hold on to that phrase. It is enough to imagine that small beginnings can lead to large differences over time, because that is exactly what happens when you step into the past. You become one of those small beginnings. Perhaps you speak to someone who would not have met you otherwise. Perhaps that conversation delays them by a moment. Perhaps that moment changes something else somewhere further along. A train missed, a meeting shifted, a decision reconsidered, and each of those changes creates its own ripple, none of them dramatic, none of them obvious, but together they begin to reshape the path of events. So now, when you try to use your knowledge of the future, something subtle begins to slip. The outcomes you remember may no longer unfold in exactly the same way. Take something that seems simple, like predicting a random event. You might remember a sequence of numbers, drawn from a system designed to appear unpredictable. You recall them clearly, confidently, and you share them. But what you may not see is how many tiny conditions lead to that outcome. The movement of air, the slight imperfections in a machine, the timing of each motion, all of these factors combine in ways that are too complex to fully trace. And if even one of those conditions shifts, even slightly, the result can change. Not drastically, but enough that the sequence you remember is no longer exact. And when that happens, your certainty softens. Your prediction becomes close, but not perfect. And close is not the same as convincing. You might try again, thinking perhaps the first attempt was unusual, but each attempt now carries the same quiet uncertainty. Because the future you knew is no longer fixed. It has become something else, something fluid, something that adapts as the present changes. This does not mean that everything becomes unpredictable. Patterns still exist. Large events may still occur. The world does not collapse into chaos. But the fine details, the exact outcomes, begin to drift. And those details are precisely what you need to prove that you came from a different time. There is something almost poetic about this. The very act of travelling through time changes the thing you are trying to prove. You carry knowledge of what will happen, but your presence quietly reshapes what will happen. Like trying to describe the path of smoke. While standing in the wind, you can see the general direction, the broad movement, but the delicate twists, the exact curves, slip away. And this brings us to a deeper realization. It is not just that predicting the future takes time, it is that the future itself is not a perfectly stable thing. It is sensitive, responsive, alive with small variations that grow over time. So even if you remember everything correctly, even if your memory is flawless, the world you've returned to is not exactly the same world you left. It is close, familiar, recognizable, but not identical. And that difference, however small, is enough to weaken your proof. Because now, even your most precise knowledge carries a shadow of uncertainty, a quiet space where things might not align exactly as expected. And in that space, doubt finds room to grow again. As you rest with this idea, letting it settle gently, you may begin to feel the problem becoming even more delicate. Not only must you overcome disbelief, not only must you provide evidence that feels immediate and undeniable, you must do so in a world that is subtly shifting beneath your feet. A world where even the future itself is not entirely reliable. And this leads almost naturally to another quiet observation. even when your evidence is strong, even when it is immediate, even when it survives these small instabilities, there is still one more force at work, something quieter than physics, something closer to human nature, because even in a perfectly stable world, even with perfect evidence, people still prefer explanations that feel familiar, and that preference can quietly outweigh even the most extraordinary truth. As that sense of instability settles, the idea that even the future itself can shift, ever so slightly, something else begins to surface, not in the world outside, but in the way we interpret it. Because even if you imagine just for a moment that everything aligned perfectly, that your knowledge remained accurate, that your discoveries were verified, that your predictions unfolded exactly as remembered, there is still one quiet force that shapes everything that follows, and it lives not in physics, but in the human mind. It is a simple tendency, almost invisible, and yet it guides so many of our beliefs. We prefer explanations that feel familiar, not because they are always correct, but because they are easier to hold, easier to understand, easier to fit into the world as we already know it. You may have noticed this in small everyday moments, a sound in another room, and your mind quickly settles on something ordinary. The wind, a shifting object, a door that wasn't quite closed. You don't immediately imagine something extraordinary, not because it is impossible, but because it is unnecessary. The familiar explanation arrives first and quietly takes its place. And in most cases, it is right. So this habit becomes reinforced, strengthened over time, until it feels almost automatic. Now imagine applying that same instinct to something much larger, someone standing before you, calmly explaining that they have travelled through time, even if their knowledge is precise, even if their evidence is strong. The mind does what it always does. It searches for a simpler story. Perhaps they are incredibly intelligent, someone who has studied deeply, who has connected ideas in ways that others have not yet seen. Perhaps they have access to information that is not widely known, or perhaps they are simply lucky, unlikely, yes, but still within the boundaries of what we understand. And so, these explanations begin to gather, not as a rejection of what you're saying, but as a way of containing it, keeping it within a world that still feels stable. Because accepting time travel is not just about accepting a single idea. It requires a shift in how time itself is understood. It suggests that the future is not sealed away, but can reach back. That cause and effect might not move in only one direction, that events can loop, overlap and influence themselves. And that is a large shift, a quiet but profound one. So the mind quite gently resists it. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but by offering alternatives, stories that feel closer, more grounded, more in line with what has already been experienced. And this is where something almost paradoxical begins to happen. The stronger your evidence becomes, the more effort the mind may put into finding a simpler explanation, not out of stubbornness, but out of habit. Because the familiar is comfortable, it requires less change, less adjustment, less rethinking of everything that has come before. You might imagine belief as something like a landscape, a wide open space shaped over time by experience, knowledge and memory. Most ideas fit easily into that space. They settle into existing patterns, reinforcing what is already there. But some ideas, like time travel, do not fit so easily. They require new shapes, new structures, new ways of connecting things together, and building those structures takes effort. So instead, the mind often reshapes the idea itself until it fits into what already exists. Your knowledge becomes expertise, your accuracy becomes luck, your insight becomes brilliance, and slowly, the extraordinary is softened into something ordinary. There's also another layer to this, one that feels even quieter. Trust. Because belief is not only about logic, it is also about the person presenting the idea. Who are you? Where did you come from? Why should someone believe you? Over all the other explanations that seem possible, even with strong evidence, trust must still be built, and trust takes time that you may not have. So you find yourself in a delicate position. You have knowledge that feels undeniable to you. You have evidence that seems strong, and yet, the way it is received depends on something much softer, something shaped by familiarity, comfort, and expectation. And this is what makes the challenge so quietly persistent. It is not enough to show something that is true. You must show it in a way that feels like the only possible explanation, a way that leaves no room for simpler stories to take hold, and that is extraordinarily difficult. Because simple stories are powerful. They're easy to remember, easy to share, easy to believe. They move quickly, like water finding the lowest point, filling every space that is available. And unless something blocks them, something stronger, clearer, more immediate, they will always find a way to settle. As you let this idea drift through your thoughts, you may begin to notice how often it appears in everyday life, how easily we accept explanations that feel familiar, even when something more complex might be true, and how rarely we are forced to confront ideas that require us to reshape our understanding entirely. Time travel is one of those ideas, not because it is impossible, but because it asks too much of the mind, too much change, too much adjustment, too much uncertainty. And so, even when you stand there, with knowledge, with evidence, with carefully constructed proof, you are not only facing the world as it is, you are facing the way people make sense of it. And that may be the greater challenge, because even perfect evidence can be quietly transformed into something ordinary if the mind is given enough room to do so. And this brings us gently to another realization. Even if you could overcome doubt, even if you could provide evidence that feels immediate, layered, and difficult to explain, there is still something else to consider, something that has nothing to do with belief, nothing to do with interpretation, something much more direct. Because sometimes, knowing too much does not lead to understanding. It leads somewhere else entirely. As that quiet pattern settles, the way simple explanations gently reshape even the strongest evidence, there is one more layer waiting beneath it, something less about logic and more about how people respond when they encounter something that feels unfamiliar. Because even if you imagine just for a moment that everything has aligned in your favor, your knowledge is precise, your discoveries have been verified, your explanations have become difficult to dismiss, there is still a question that remains, and it is not about whether people can believe you, but whether they want to. And sometimes the answer to that question is more complicated than it first appears. Because throughout history, when people have encountered something they could not easily explain, their response has not always been curiosity. Sometimes it has been something quieter and more cautious. You might picture a small village, long before modern science offered explanations for the natural world, where knowledge was often passed through tradition, through stories, through shared experience. In such a place, the boundaries of understanding were narrower, but also more stable. People knew what to expect, and what fell outside those expectations could feel unsettling. Now imagine someone arriving there, speaking with unusual certainty, describing events that have not yet occurred, revealing details that no one else could know. At first, this might seem impressive, even fascinating, but as the pattern continues, as the knowledge becomes more specific, more consistent, something else begins to grow alongside it, a quiet unease. Because when something cannot be explained within the existing framework of understanding, it does not simply remain neutral. It begins to press against that framework, to stretch it, to challenge it. And not everyone is comfortable with that. In some cases, unfamiliar knowledge has been interpreted not as insight, but as something unnatural, not as discovery, but as interference, something that does not belong. You may have heard stories of individuals who are misunderstood in this way, whose ideas seem too far ahead of their time, too difficult to reconcile with what others believe to be true. Sometimes they were dismissed, sometimes ignored, and occasionally treated with suspicion, not because they were wrong, but because they were difficult to place. And this brings us back gently to your situation. If you were to stand in the past, demonstrating knowledge that feels precise, layered, and difficult to explain, you might expect that this would lead to recognition, to understanding, to belief. But there is another possibility, one that unfolds quietly, that your knowledge, instead of being accepted, becomes something that people cannot comfortably interpret. And when that happens, the response is not always belief. Sometimes it is distance. Sometimes it is doubt that feels heavier, more cautious, and sometimes it becomes something closer to fear. Not dramatic fear, not immediate rejection, but a subtle shift in how others relate to you, a hesitation, a sense that you are not quite like them, not quite part of the same world. Because knowledge, when it fits within expectations, feels safe. But when it stretches beyond those expectations, it begins to feel unpredictable. And unpredictability, especially in unfamiliar environments, is something people naturally try to avoid. There's also something else to consider, something that feels even more delicate. Trust is not built only on correctness. It is built on familiarity, on shared understanding, on a sense of connection. When someone speaks in ways that align with what we already know, trust grows easily. But when someone consistently presents ideas that feel distant, unusual, or difficult to place, that trust can become harder to establish, even if those ideas are true. So now the challenge becomes even more complex. You're not only trying to provide evidence that cannot be explained away by simpler ideas, you're also trying to do so in a way that feels acceptable, approachable, and safe to those around you. And that balance is not easy to achieve, because the very thing that makes your knowledge convincing, its precision, its consistency, its difference, is also what makes it stand out. And what stands out can sometimes be difficult to accept. You might think of it like introducing a new idea into a conversation that has followed the same patterns for a long time. At first, it is noticed, then considered. But if it continues to challenge the structure of the conversation itself, it begins to feel disruptive. Not because it is wrong, but because it changes the rhythm, and people often prefer to maintain the rhythm they know. So even in a situation where your evidence is strong, where your explanations are layered and carefully presented, there remains this quiet possibility. That belief does not arrive, not fully, not comfortably, and that your presence, instead of being understood, becomes something that others step back from, something they observe with a mix of curiosity and caution. As you rest with this idea, letting it move gently through your thoughts, you may begin to see that proving you are a time traveler is not just a problem of knowledge, or evidence, or even physics. It is also a problem of human response, of how people interpret what they cannot easily explain, of how they react when something does not fit into their existing picture of the world. And that picture, however flexible it may seem, has its own quiet boundaries. So even if you find a way to present evidence that feel immediate, layered, and difficult to dismiss, even if you manage to overcome the simpler explanations, the shifting future, the limitations of prediction, there is still this final uncertainty, not whether your proof is sufficient, but whether it will be received in the way you hope. And somewhere within that uncertainty, another realization begins to form, softer now, more grounded, more physical. Because before any of this can happen, before proof, before belief, before interpretation, there is something much more immediate to consider, something that does not depend on what others think, something that depends only on you, whether you could remain there in that earlier world long enough to try it all. As that question settles, whether anyone would believe you, another quieter one begins to take its place, almost unnoticed at first, but far more immediate in its consequences. Because before you can prove anything, before you can demonstrate knowledge or build trust, there is something much simpler and much more physical that must come first. You have to live, not in the world you know, but in a version of it that feels familiar only at a distance, like a place seen in a photograph, where everything looks recognizable, and yet something essential is missing. At first, you might not notice it. You wake up, you look around, and the shapes of things seem right. The land is still there. The sky stretches above you in the same quiet way, and the air moves gently just as it always has. But then, slowly, your attention turns to something you might normally take for granted. Food. In your everyday life, food is abundant, varied, and often designed to be comforting. Fruits are sweet, vegetables are soft, grains are easy to prepare and digest. Everything feels familiar, almost effortless. But in the past, that familiarity begins to fade, because the foods you know today are the result of a long, quiet process of cultivation, refinement, and selection. Over many generations, plants have been shaped to be softer, sweeter, easier to eat, and less harmful. Without that process, the natural world feels very different. You might pick up something that looks like a fruit, only to find that it is bitter, tough, and difficult to chew. The texture may feel dense, almost fibrous, resisting your teeth rather than yielding to them. Vegetation that appears edible may be filled with strands that do not break down easily, leaving you with something that feels less like nourishment and more like chewing through dry, unyielding material. You might imagine trying to eat something that resembles a modern vegetable, only to discover that it has none of the softness you expect. It does not dissolve gently as you chew. It remains firm, resistant, almost like trying to break down something closer to thin strands of wood than to food. And even when you manage to swallow it, your body may struggle to process it in the way it is used to. Because your digestion, like everything else about you, has adapted to a very different environment. There is also another layer, one that feels less obvious, but carries its own quiet weight. Not everything that looks edible is safe. In the world you're used to, harmful compounds in plants have often been reduced through careful cultivation. Over time, people have selected for varieties that are less toxic, less irritating, less likely to cause harm. But in earlier times, many plants still carry their natural defenses, substances that evolved to discourage animals from eating them, compounds that can irritate or disrupt or slowly harm the body if consumed without knowledge or preparation. And without that knowledge, without the quiet accumulation of generations who learned what is safe and what is not, you may find yourself navigating a landscape where food is uncertain. Something that should sustain you becomes something you must approach carefully, something that requires attention, caution, and sometimes restraint. You may think of it like walking through a room filled with objects that look familiar, but behave differently when touched. A surface that appears soft might be rough. Something that seems harmless may not be. And this uncertainty changes the experience of something as simple as eating. It is no longer automatic. It becomes deliberate, measured, careful. There is also the matter of availability. In your world, food is often just a short distance away. A store, a kitchen, a prepared meal waiting quietly for you. But in the past, food is something you must find. Something you must gather, or grow, or prepare from raw materials. And that process takes time, energy, knowledge. You might spend hours searching only to find something that offers very little in return. A plant that provides minimal nourishment. Something that fills your stomach but does not truly sustain you. And slowly, gently, this begins to affect you. Not dramatically at first. Just a subtle sense of fatigue. A quiet decrease in energy. A feeling that your body is working harder than usual. For less. Because it is. And as time passes, that imbalance becomes more noticeable. You begin to understand that survival here is not just about finding food, but about finding the right food. Food that your body can use. Food that provides enough energy to keep you moving, thinking, adapting. And that is not always easy to find. As you rest with this idea, letting it settle into something almost tangible, you may begin to feel the weight of it. Not as fear, not as urgency, but as a quiet recognition that the world you know is not the world you would return to, even though it looks the same, even though it feels familiar at a glance. It is in many ways a different place, a place where the simplest assumptions no longer hold, and where something as ordinary as eating becomes something you must learn again, slowly, carefully, as if for the first time. And this is only the beginning, because food is just one part of the environment that surrounds you. There is something else, less visible, that you encounter with every breath. Something that fills the space around you, unnoticed most of the time, and yet shapes your experience in ways that are just as important: the air itself. As that thought lingers, the quiet effort of finding food, of learning again what can be eaten and what cannot, your attention begins to drift towards something even more constant, something that surrounds you completely, yet is so easy to overlook: the air. You don't usually think about it, not in a deliberate way. You breathe in, you breathe out, and the process continues without effort, without attention, almost without awareness. It is one of the most stable parts of your experience, and because of that, it feels as though it would remain unchanged no matter when you are. But the air, like everything else, carries its own quiet history. Its composition, the balance of the gases within it, has shifted slowly over time, shaped by forests, oceans, and the countless small processes that occur across the surface of the Earth. If you were to move far enough back, not just decades, but deep into earlier periods of the planet's past, the air you breathe might begin to feel different. Not dramatically at first, not in a way that immediately alarms you, but subtly, almost imperceptibly. Imagine taking a breath and noticing that it feels slightly heavier, as though the air carries a little more weight than you expect. Not enough to stop you from breathing, but enough to create a faint sense that something is not quite as easy as it should be. There is a gentle resistance, a quiet thickness. One of the reasons for this lies in a gas you already know, even if you rarely think about it directly. Carbon dioxide. In your time, it is present in the air in small amounts, a natural part of the atmosphere, produced by breathing, by decay, by countless processes that release it into the environment. But in earlier periods of Earth's history, its presence could be higher. Not always, not in every moment, but enough to shift the balance. And when that balance changes, the experience of breathing changes with it. You might notice that your breaths feel less refreshing, that the sense of ease you're used to, the effortless exchange of air, becomes slightly less complete. It is not that you cannot breathe. You can, but each breath feels as though it gives you a little less than you expect, a little less clarity, a little less energy, like trying to fill a cup that never quite reaches the top. This happens because your body relies on a delicate balance. When you breathe in, you're not simply taking in air, you're exchanging gases, allowing oxygen to enter your bloodstream while releasing carbon dioxide back into the air. This exchange depends on differences in concentration, gentle gradients that guide the movement of these gases in and out of your body. When the amount of carbon dioxide in the surrounding air rises, even slightly, those gradients begin to soften. The exchange still happens, but not as efficiently, and over time, that small difference begins to accumulate. You may find yourself feeling slightly more tired than usual, not in a dramatic way, just a quiet sense of fatigue that lingers beneath everything. Your thoughts may feel a little slower, your movements a little heavier, and all of this happens without any clear cause, without any visible sign that something is wrong. It is simply the air. There is also another layer to this, one that is less obvious, but just as important. The air carries more than just oxygen and carbon dioxide. It carries particles, subtle traces of the environment around you. In a world that has not been shaped by modern filtration, by controlled environments, by the systems that quietly clean and regulate the spaces you inhabit, the air may feel less refined, less consistent, more connected to the land itself. You might notice faint differences in smell, in texture, in how it feels as you breathe it in, and over time, your body must adapt, but adaptation takes time, and you may not have that time, because survival in this earlier world is not only about avoiding danger, it is about maintaining balance, energy, nourishment, breath, all working together, quietly supporting you. And when one of those elements begins to shift, even slightly, it affects the others. Less efficient breathing means less available energy. Less energy makes it harder to search for food. Difficulty finding food makes it harder to sustain your body, and so a gentle chain begins to form, each part connected to the next, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but persistent. You might think of it like walking uphill without realizing it. At first, the effort feels normal. Then gradually you begin to notice the strain. Not because anything has suddenly changed, but because the conditions have been different all along. And this is what makes the experience so subtle and so difficult. There is no clear moment where you can say, this is when it became harder. It simply is. And as you rest with this idea, allowing it to settle into the quiet background of your thoughts, you may begin to see that the world you've arrived in is not just unfamiliar in its details, but in its balance, the same earth, the same sky, and yet not quite the same environment, not quite the same conditions that your body has come to expect. And this brings us gently to another realization. Survival is not only about understanding the world around you, it is about being suited to it, about fitting into its conditions in a way that allows you to move, to think, to continue. And when that fit is slightly off, even in ways that are difficult to notice, the challenge becomes something deeper, something that cannot be solved quickly, something that unfolds slowly, quietly, with each breath you take. And even if you manage to adapt, even if your body finds a way to continue, there is still one more layer waiting, because the environment is not only about food or air, it is about everything that surrounds you, the plants, the land, the unseen details of the ecosystem itself, and whether you, as you are now, can truly exist within it. As that awareness settles, the subtle weight in the air, the quiet effort behind each breath, you begin to notice that the challenge of survival is not just about individual elements like food or atmosphere. It is about how everything comes together. Because the world you've arrived in is not simply an earlier version of your own. It is a system, one that has been shaping itself for thousands, sometimes millions of years, adapting in ways that are deeply interconnected. And you, standing within it, are not part of that system. At least, not in the way you might expect. At first, this difference is almost invisible. You can still walk, still move, still observe the environment around you. The ground feels solid beneath your feet. The sky stretches above you in a way that feels familiar, and the rhythm of day and night continues as it always has. But beneath that surface, something is slightly misaligned, because your body, as it exists now, is the result of a long chain of adaptation to a very specific set of conditions. The food you eat, the air you breathe, the microorganisms you encounter every day without even noticing. All of these have shaped you quietly over time, and when those conditions change, even slightly, your body must respond. Sometimes it can, sometimes it cannot. One of the most subtle, yet significant differences lies in something you cannot see directly: the microscopic life that surrounds you. In your own time, your body exists in balance with a vast community of microorganisms. Bacteria, fungi, and other tiny forms of life live on your skin, within your digestive system, and throughout your environment. Most of the time, this relationship is stable, not perfect, but balanced. Your body recognizes what belongs and responds to what does not. But when you step into a different time, that balance may no longer hold. The microorganisms in the environment around you may be unfamiliar. Some may interact with your body in ways it is not prepared for. Others, which your body expects to encounter, may be absent, and this creates a kind of quiet uncertainty. Your immune system, the part of you that constantly works to protect you, is now navigating a landscape it does not fully recognize. It may respond too strongly, or not strongly enough. Either way, the balance is disturbed. You might not notice it immediately. At first, everything feels manageable. But over time, small changes begin to accumulate. A lingering discomfort, a sense that your body is working harder than usual. That something is slightly off, even if you cannot quite explain why. There is also the matter of plants, not just as food, but as part of the environment itself. Many plants produce natural compounds, subtle chemical defenses that help them survive. In your time, many of these compounds have been reduced through careful selection and cultivation. But in earlier environments, those defenses are still present, sometimes in stronger forms. You might come into contact with a plant that seems harmless, only to find that it irritates your skin or causes a reaction that feels unfamiliar, something small, but enough to remind you that this world operates by slightly different rules. Even the act of moving through the environment can feel different. The terrain may be less predictable, paths less defined, the balance between what is safe and what is not less clearly marked. In your own time, much of the world has been shaped to support human activity. Roads, structures, systems, all quietly guiding your movement, reducing uncertainty. But here, that structure is absent. You're navigating something more raw, more immediate, and that requires a different kind of awareness, a different kind of energy. And energy, as you have already begun to notice, is not as easy to maintain. because everything is connected. Less efficient breathing leads to less available energy. Less energy makes it harder to find food. Uncertain food sources make it harder to sustain your body, and a body that is not fully adapted to its environment must work harder just to remain stable. There is something quietly humbling about this realization, that even if you carry knowledge, even if you understand things that others do not, your body is still bound by the same constraints as everyone else. You cannot think your way out of hunger. You cannot reason your way into better air. You cannot rely on knowledge alone when the environment itself does not support you. And so, the idea of survival begins to shift. It is no longer just about avoiding danger, it is about compatibility, about whether you, as you are, can exist within a system that was not shaped for you. And the answer to that question is not always certain. You might adapt, slowly, carefully, learning what to eat, how to move, how to respond to the subtle signals of your body. But adaptation takes time, and time may not be something you have in abundance, because while you are learning, your body is already under strain, already adjusting, already working to find balance in a world that does not quite match its expectations. And this brings us to a quiet but important realization. Traveling into the past is not simply a matter of arriving, it is a matter of fitting, of aligning with an environment that may look familiar, but operates in ways that are just different enough to matter. And if that alignment cannot be found, then everything else, the knowledge, the proof, the questions of belief, begins to fade into the background, because none of it matters if you cannot remain there long enough to try. As this thought settles gently and without urgency, another perspective begins to open, because the challenge of survival, the difficulty of existing in a different time, is not only a problem of the past, it is also a problem of distance, of separation, of how far you are, not just from your own time, but from everything that supports you. And that distance, as it turns out, is not only measured in years, it is measured in something else entirely, something that stretches quietly across the universe, something that shapes not only how we live, but how we communicate, how we connect, and how we understand the limits of what is possible. As that sense of survival settles, the quiet realization that simply existing in another time is already uncertain, your attention begins to drift outward, away from the body, away from the ground beneath your feet, and into something larger. Because distance is not only something you feel when you're separated from your own time, it is something that exists everywhere, between places, between people, between any 2 points that are not exactly the same. And in your everyday life, distance often feels small. You send a message, and it arrives almost instantly. You speak, and someone hears you in the same moment. The world feels connected, seamless, as though information can move freely without delay. But this sense of immediacy is something quite special, something that depends on how close everything is. Because when distance begins to grow, even slightly, that seamless connection begins to change. You might imagine standing on the surface of the earth, speaking to someone just a short distance away. Your voice travels through the air, reaching them almost immediately. There is a pause so small that it is barely noticeable, and so conversation feels natural, continuous. But now imagine that the distance grows, not across a room, but across space itself. If you were to send a signal to the moon, that quiet companion that hangs in the night sky, the message would not arrive instantly. It would take just over a second, a small delay, but enough that you might begin to notice it. You speak, and then you wait, only briefly. but the rhythm of conversation begins to stretch. You no longer speak and hear in the same moment. There is a gap, a space where nothing happens, and that gap changes the feeling of connection. Now imagine that distance growing further, to a place like Mars, a planet that sometimes appears as a small reddish point in the sky. Here, the delay becomes longer, not just a second, but several minutes, sometimes only a few, sometimes longer, depending on how the planets are positioned. You send a message, and then you wait, and wait. Minutes pass before a reply can even begin. Conversation becomes something different, not an exchange, but a sequence. You speak, then silence, then eventually a response, and by the time that response arrives, the moment you were responding to has already passed. Now imagine stretching that distance even further, toward the outer regions of the solar system where planets like Jupiter drift in slow, distant orbits. Here, the delay grows longer still, tens of minutes, nearly an hour. You send a signal, and then you wait, not for a brief pause, but for a significant portion of time, and when the reply finally arrives, it reflects a moment that is already far behind you. The conversation no longer feels like a shared experience. It becomes something more like reading letters, sent back and forth across a great distance, each message arriving long after it was written. And if you continue even further, beyond the planets, beyond the edges of our solar system, toward the nearest stars, the delay becomes something else entirely. Years. A message sent toward the closest star system would take several years just to arrive, and several more years for a reply to return. At that scale, conversation as we know it simply does not exist. It becomes something slower, something quieter, something that unfolds across long stretches of time. And this is not a limitation of technology. It is not something that can be solved by building a faster device or a more powerful system. It is something deeper, a fundamental feature of the universe itself. Because all information, whether it is carried by light, by radio signals, or by any other means we currently understand, moves at a finite speed, a speed that is incredibly fast, so fast that it can circle the Earth many times in a single second. And yet, even that speed is not infinite. It does not allow instant connection across large distances, and so, as distance increases, delay becomes unavoidable. There is something quietly profound about this, because it means that immediacy, the sense of being connected in the same moment, is not a universal property. It is something local, something that exists only when distances are small enough, and beyond that, time begins to stretch between every interaction, between every exchange, between every attempt to connect. As you rest with this idea, you may begin to see how it relates in a subtle way to the problem of proving time travel, because proof, like conversation, often depends on immediacy, on the ability to show something and have it understood in the same moment. But when delay enters the system, whether through time, through distance, or through the slow unfolding of events, that immediacy begins to fade. And without immediacy, certainty becomes harder to achieve. Messages can be misunderstood, responses can arrive too late, connections can weaken, and even when everything is functioning exactly as it should, the experience itself changes. It becomes slower, more fragmented, more uncertain. So now, the challenge you face is not only about knowledge, or survival, or belief. It is also about connection, about whether you can bridge the gap between what you know and what others can understand. In a world where even simple communication is shaped by distance, and that distance, as it turns out, is not just a matter of space, it is also a matter of time, because the further something must travel, the longer it takes to arrive, and in that waiting, something is always lost, not completely, not irreversibly, but enough to change the way it is received. As this thought settles, quietly expanding into the space around it, another realization begins to form, because if distance limits how quickly information can travel, then there must be something that defines that limit, something that sets the maximum speed at which anything can move or be known across the universe, and that limit is not something we can simply overcome. It is something we must understand, something that quietly shapes everything that follows. As that sense of distance settles in, the idea that even a simple message must wait, stretching across seconds, then minutes, then years, something deeper begins to take shape beneath it. Because if every signal, every piece of information, every attempt to connect must travel through space with a delay, then there must be something setting that pace, something quietly defining how fast anything can move, or be known, or be shared across the universe. And there is. Not a machine, not a barrier you can touch, but a property woven into the fabric of reality itself. There is a maximum speed at which information can travel, a kind of universal rhythm that nothing can exceed, no matter how advanced the technology becomes, and this speed is carried by light. You don't need to think of it as a number, or a formula, or anything technical. It is enough to imagine that light moves incredibly fast, so fast that it can circle the Earth many times in the space of a single second, and yet, even at that extraordinary pace, it still takes time to cross large distances. This is the quiet limit that shapes everything. Because whenever you see something, you're not seeing it as it is in the present moment, but as it was when the light left it. When you look at the moon, you are seeing it as it was just over a second ago. When you look at the sun, you're seeing it as it was several minutes in the past. And when you look at distant stars, you're seeing light that has travelled for years, sometimes for centuries, before reaching your eyes. In this way, the universe is always slightly delayed, always showing you a version of itself that belongs to an earlier moment. There is something quietly beautiful about that, but also something limiting, because it means that information is never truly instantaneous. No matter how much you try to speed it up, no matter how refined the system becomes, there is always a delay, always a small stretch of time between an event and your awareness of it. And as distances grow, that delay grows with them until it becomes something you cannot ignore, something that reshapes the way you think about connection itself. You might begin to see this not just as a limitation, but as a kind of structure, a rule that keeps everything in order. If information could travel infinitely fast, then cause and effect would begin to blur. Events could influence each other without any sense of sequence, without any clear direction. But because there is a limit, because information moves at a finite speed, there is always a sense of progression, a quiet flow from one moment to the next. And this flow is what allows the universe to remain coherent. It is what allows events to unfold in a way that can be understood, even if only partially. It creates a gentle boundary around what is possible, not in a restrictive way, but in a way that maintains consistency, that preserves the idea that one thing leads to another, that time has a direction, even if that direction is not always as simple as it seems. As you rest with this idea, the quiet presence of a universal speed limit, you may begin to see how it connects back to the problem we started with. Because proving that you are from the future depends in some way on the ability to transfer information across time, to carry knowledge from one moment to another in a way that feels immediate, undeniable, and clear. But if even space itself introduces delay, if even light must take time to move from one place to another, then the idea of moving information across time becomes even more complex. Not impossible, perhaps, but constrained, bound by the same quiet rules that govern everything else. You cannot simply reach across time in the way you might reach across a table. You cannot send a message backward or forward without considering how that message would travel, how it would interact with the structure of the universe itself. And this is where the idea of time travel begins to feel less like a simple extension of movement and more like something that must work within these deeper constraints. It must respect the way information flows, the way events are connected, the way the universe maintains its internal consistency. There is also something else, something more subtle that emerges from this. Because if there is a maximum speed for information, then there are limits to what can be known and when it can be known. There are boundaries around knowledge itself, boundaries that are not imposed by lack of intelligence or lack of effort, but by the structure of reality. You cannot know something before the information has reached you. You cannot respond to an event that you have not yet observed. And even if you were to travel through time, even if you were to carry knowledge from one moment to another, that knowledge would still exist within a universe that enforces these limits, that shapes how information moves and how it can be verified. So the challenge becomes layered. It is not only about having knowledge, it is not only about presenting evidence, it is also about navigating a universe where information itself is constrained, where immediacy is local, and where distance, whether in space or in time, introduces delay that cannot be fully removed. As this thought settles, slowly, gently, like light crossing a vast distance, another idea begins to form, one that feels almost like a quiet question at the edge of understanding. If there is a limit to how fast information can travel, then is there a way to bypass that limit? A way to connect distant points without waiting? A way to move or communicate without crossing the space in between? And this is where the imagination often turns to something more speculative, something that feels like a shortcut through the structure of the universe itself. A kind of bridge that does not follow the usual path, but instead links two distant places directly. A concept that feels almost like folding space, bringing distant points together so that what was once far apart becomes close. But as we will see, even that idea carries its own quiet complications, its own hidden costs, waiting just beneath the surface. As that idea settles, the quiet presence of a universal speed limit, shaping every exchange, every signal, every attempt to connect across distance, it is almost natural for the mind to begin searching for a way around it. Not to break the rules exactly, but to find a path that doesn't quite follow the usual route, a way of moving that feels less like travelling through space, and more like stepping across it. And this is where the idea of a wormhole begins to appear, not as a machine you could build in a workshop, but as a possibility suggested by the deeper structure of space itself, a kind of bridge that could, in theory, connect two distant points directly, so that what was once separated by vast stretches becomes quietly adjacent. You might imagine taking a sheet of paper and drawing two dots on it, one on the left, one on the right, and then folding the paper gently until those dots touch. The distance between them hasn't disappeared, but the path connecting them has changed. Instead of travelling across the surface, you move through the fold, stepping from one point to the other without crossing the space in between. It is a simple image, almost playful, and yet it carries within it a profound idea. If space itself could bend, if it could curve in such a way that distant locations become neighbours, then perhaps distance would no longer be a barrier. Perhaps the long delays, the waiting, the quiet stretching of time between messages could be bypassed entirely. At first, this feels like an answer, a gentle solution to the problem introduced by distance, a way to restore immediacy to a universe that otherwise insists on delay. But as with so many things in this journey, the deeper you look, the more delicate the picture becomes. Because a wormhole, if it exists, is not an empty tunnel, not a smooth, quiet passage waiting patiently for you to walk through. It is a region where the structure of space is being held in an unusual configuration, where immense forces are balanced in a way that is not naturally stable. And that balance is not gentle. Imagine opening a door between two rooms that are not in equilibrium, where the air pressure on one side is different from the other. The moment the door opens, air begins to move, rushing from one side to the other, trying to equalize the difference. The flow is not subtle. It can be forceful, even violent, depending on how large the difference is. Now imagine that effect, not just between two rooms, but between two regions of space that may have very different conditions. The air, if there is air, could rush through the opening at tremendous speeds, far faster than anything you would experience in an ordinary environment. Not a gentle breeze, not even a strong wind, but something closer to a powerful, sustained force, capable of pushing, pulling, and reshaping everything in its path, and it would not stop immediately. Because the system would be trying to reach balance, to smooth out the differences between the two regions, and that process could take time. There's also the matter of temperature. Different regions of space, or even different environments on the same planet, can have very different temperatures. When they are suddenly connected, heat begins to flow just as air does, moving from warmer areas to cooler ones, seeking equilibrium. This can create rapid changes, sudden shifts that feel less like stepping into another room and more like being caught in a transition, a space where conditions are changing around you. And all of this assumes that the wormhole itself remains stable, that it does not collapse, distort, or behave in ways that are difficult to predict. Because maintaining such a structure would likely require forms of energy or matter that we do not yet fully understand, things that behave differently from anything we encounter in everyday life. You might think of it as holding open a passage that space itself would prefer to close, maintaining a shape that is not its natural state. And that requires effort, continuous effort. So now, the idea that once felt like a shortcut begins to feel more complex, more fragile, less like a doorway, and more like a phenomenon, something that must be carefully maintained, something that comes with its own set of challenges. There is also something quietly ironic about this. In trying to escape the limits of distance, you encounter a new set of limits, ones that are not about how far you must travel, but about how the universe behaves when you try to reshape it. It is as though every path around a constraint leads to another deeper layer of structure, another boundary that must be understood rather than avoided. And this brings us back gently to the problem we have been carrying throughout this journey, proving that you are a time traveller. Because even if a wormhole could exist, even if it could connect distant points in space or time, even if you could pass through it and arrive somewhere else, the question remains, what would you bring with you? What evidence would survive the journey? What proof could you offer in a world that already struggles to interpret what you know, to believe what you say, to accept what you represent? The wormhole, in this sense, does not solve the problem. It only changes its form. It moves you from one place to another, but it does not guarantee that you can be understood when you arrive. And so, as this idea settles, the quiet image of a doorway that is not really a doorway, a bridge that carries its own hidden forces, you may begin to feel that the challenge of time travel is not just about moving through time. It is about everything that comes with that movement, the physics that shapes it, the environment that receives you, the people who interpret your presence, and the limits that remain no matter how far you go. Because even if you could cross the greatest distances, even if you could step through the fabric of space itself, there is still one boundary that quietly remains, not in the world outside, but within the way knowledge itself is held, shared and understood, a boundary that is not about speed or distance or energy, but about the simple question of how much any one mind can truly carry. As that image settles, of a doorway that bends space, of forces quietly balancing and resisting, of limits that remain no matter how far you travel, the focus begins to shift once again, moving away from the structure of the universe and towards something much closer, something far more familiar, the mind itself. Because even if you could move through time, even if you could cross vast distances or step through unusual pathways in the fabric of space, everything you carry with you would still pass through a single place, your own understanding, and that introduces a different kind of limit, not one imposed by physics, but one shaped by scale. There was a time long ago when human knowledge felt containable, when the total number of written works in a language was small enough that a dedicated person, given enough time, could read nearly all of them. Not easily, not quickly, but in principle, it was possible. You could imagine someone moving slowly through a library, turning pages one by one, gradually building a picture of everything that was known within that space. And while that picture would never be perfect, it could feel complete. There is something almost comforting about that idea, that knowledge could be gathered, held, understood as a whole, but over time, something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, almost quietly. Knowledge began to grow, at first in small increments, new discoveries, new writings, new ideas adding themselves to what already existed, then faster, more people contributing, more fields emerging, more questions being asked and answered and replaced with new questions. And eventually the pace of that growth became something else entirely, exponential, not a straight line, but a curve that rises more and more steeply as it continues. You don't need to picture a graph or a formula to feel this. It is enough to imagine something doubling and doubling again and again until it expands far beyond what can be easily followed. And now, in the present, knowledge has reached a point where it no longer fits within a single mind. Not even close. No one person can read everything. No one person can understand every field. No one person can hold even a small fraction of what is collectively known. Instead, knowledge has become distributed, fragmented, spread across countless individuals, institutions, cultures, and systems. Each person holds a piece, a small part of a much larger whole, and that whole is not fully visible from any single perspective. There is something quietly profound about this, because it means that even in your own time, even with all the tools available to you, you do not carry complete knowledge, you carry a selection, a path through the landscape of information, and that path, while meaningful, is still limited. Now imagine carrying that limitation into another time, even if you remember what you know with perfect clarity, even if your memory is flawless, what you know is still only a fragment of what exists. You cannot describe everything. You cannot predict every outcome. You cannot reveal every hidden truth, because those truths are not all held in one place. They never were. And this introduces a subtle but important shift in the problem. Earlier it seemed that proving you were a time traveller depended on finding the right evidence, the right demonstration, the right way to overcome doubt. But now, it begins to feel as though something else is missing, not evidence, but completeness. Because to prove that you're from the future in an undeniable way, You would need to demonstrate knowledge that feels not just impressive, not just accurate, but comprehensive. Something that suggests access to the whole, and that is something no individual possesses. Not in your time, not in any time. There is also another layer to this. Knowledge is not only growing, it is also changing. Some things are discovered, others are forgotten, techniques are lost, languages fade, methods that once existed quietly disappear, leaving behind traces that are difficult to interpret. So the idea that the future always contains more knowledge than the past is not entirely true. In some cases it contains less, or at least different knowledge. And this makes the situation even more delicate. Because if you were to bring knowledge from the future into the past, there is no guarantee that it would appear clearly superior. Some of it might, but some of it might seem incomplete, or unfamiliar, or difficult to place within the existing framework of understanding. And once again, interpretation becomes a factor. Your knowledge is not judged in isolation. It is compared, measured against what is already known and how well it fits. So now the idea of proof begins to shift again. It is no longer about presenting enough information to convince others. It is about recognizing that information itself is not something that can be fully carried, not by a single person, not across time, not in a way that captures everything that matters. As you rest with this thought, letting it settle slowly, like a quiet realization that unfolds without urgency, you may begin to feel a different kind of perspective emerging. One that is less focused on what is possible and more on what is meaningful. Because if no one can hold all knowledge, if no one can represent the entirety of a time, then perhaps the idea of proving that you belong to a different moment is not just difficult, it may be incomplete. A question that cannot be fully answered, not because the answer does not exist, but because the conditions required to express it are beyond what any one mind can carry. And this leads us gently, almost inevitably, to a final reflection, one that brings together everything we have explored, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet understanding, because the limits we have encountered are not separate. They are connected, woven together in ways that shape not just the universe, but our place within it. As that awareness settles, the quiet realization that knowledge itself cannot be fully gathered, that no single mind can hold the entirety of what a time represents, everything begins to slow down, not in a way that feels like an ending, but in a way that feels like a soft return. Because the question we started with, how to prove that you are a traveller through time, has gently transformed along the way. At first it seemed like a puzzle, something that could be solved with the right idea, the right piece of evidence, the right demonstration. Then it became more complex, a matter of belief, of interpretation, of overcoming doubt, and then deeper still, a question of survival, of whether you could even remain long enough to try. And beyond that, a question shaped by the structure of the universe itself, by the quiet limits of distance, of communication, of how information moves and arrives. And now, it has become something else entirely. A question about knowledge, not just what you know, but what it means to know anything at all. Because if you pause here just for a moment and let that idea rest, you may begin to notice something subtle. Even in your own life right now, there are things you know and things you do not know. That feels obvious. But there is also something more delicate. There are things you know without realizing that you know them. Patterns you recognize, habits you follow, understandings that guide you quietly, without needing to be spoken or fully explained. And there are also things you believe you understand that may only be partial, incomplete, shaped by perspective. Knowledge in this sense is not a solid object. It is not something that can be neatly stored, carried, and presented in its entirety. It is fluid, contextual, dependent on how it is used, how it is shared, how it is understood, and this makes the idea of proving something, especially something as extraordinary as time travel, much more delicate than it first appears, because proof, as we often imagine it, requires clarity. It requires something that can be shown, demonstrated, confirmed, something that leaves no room for doubt. But knowledge itself does not always behave that way. It shifts, it adapts, it takes on different meanings depending on who is observing it and how. So even if you were to stand in the past carrying everything you know, every memory, every piece of understanding, every fragment of the future that exists within you, what you present would still be interpreted, filtered through the minds of others, through their expectations, their experiences, their frameworks, and even within your own mind, that knowledge would not be complete. Because as we have seen, no mind holds everything, not fully, not perfectly. And so, the idea of representing an entire future becomes something that no individual can truly achieve. There's also another quiet layer to this paradox, because if knowledge is distributed, fragmented across many people, many systems, many perspectives, then the future itself is not a single unified thing. It is a collection, a vast network of understanding that cannot be reduced to a single voice. So when you say, "I am from the future," what does that really mean? Which part of the future? Which version of its knowledge? Which perspective among the many that exist? And suddenly, the question becomes less clear, less defined, more open, because the future is not a place with a single identity. It is something that emerges from countless interactions, countless discoveries, countless moments that cannot all be held at once. And that means that even if you truly are from the future, even if everything you say is accurate within your experience, you're still only carrying a fragment, a perspective, a path through something much larger. And that fragment, no matter how precise, no matter how carefully presented, cannot fully represent the whole. So now, as everything comes together, the quiet limits we have encountered begin to align. The difficulty of providing immediate proof, the instability of the future itself, the tendency of the mind to favour familiar explanations, the challenges of survival in an unfamiliar world, the constraints of distance and communication, the speed at which information can travel, the complexity and incompleteness of knowledge. Each of these on its own makes the problem harder, but together they form something deeper, a kind of boundary, not a wall, not something rigid or absolute, but a soft limit that shapes what can be known, what can be shown, and what can be believed. And within that boundary, the idea of proving time travel begins to feel less like a question waiting for an answer, and more like a reflection of those limits themselves. Not something that can be solved in a single step, but something that reveals, gently and quietly, how the world works. There is something strangely comforting in that, because it reminds us that uncertainty is not a flaw. It is a natural part of understanding, a space where curiosity lives, where questions continue to unfold even when answers remain just out of reach. And so, as you rest here, at the edge of this idea, you may find that the question no longer feels urgent. It no longer demands a clear solution. Instead, it becomes something softer, something to sit with, to let drift through your thoughts, like a distant echo that slowly fades. Because perhaps the most honest answer is also the simplest, that a time traveller, even if they exist, may never be able to prove themselves completely, not because they lack evidence, not because they lack knowledge, but because the world itself, the way we understand, interpret and share information, does not allow for that kind of certainty. And in that quiet realization, the question gently comes to rest, not solved, but understood in its own way. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open or you're already floating somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this little journey. If you'd like to join me again for more gentle wanderings, you're always welcome to subscribe or share this with someone who could use a peaceful pause. Time has a way of slipping through our fingers, but here, in this quiet moment, it's just you and the soft hush of rest. Sleep peacefully wherever and whenever you may be.